Vikings, from Old Norse Viking, were Germanic Norse seafarers, speaking the Old Norse language, who raided and traded from their Scandinavian homelands across wide areas of northern and central Europe, as well as European Russia, during the late 8th to late 11th centuries. The term is also commonly extended in modern English and other vernaculars to the inhabitants of Viking home communities during what has become known as the Viking Age. This period of Norse military, mercantile and demographic expansion constitutes an important element in the early medieval history of Scandinavia, the British Isles, France, Kievan Rus and Sicily, facilitated by advanced seafaring skills, and characterized by the longship. Viking activities at times also extended into the Mediterranean littoral, North Africa, the Middle East and Central Asia. Following extended phases of exploration, expansion and settlement, Viking communities and polities were established in diverse areas of northwestern Europe, European Russia, the North Atlantic islands and as far as the northeastern coast of North America. This period of expansion witnessed the wide dissemination of Norse culture, while simultaneously introducing strong foreign cultural influences into Scandinavia itself, with profound developmental implications in both directions. Popular, modern conceptions of the Vikings, the term frequently applied casually to their modern descendants and the inhabitants of modern Scandinavia, often strongly differ from the complex picture that emerges from archaeology and historical sources. A romanticized picture of Vikings as noble savages began to emerge in the 18th century. This developed and became widely propagated during the 19th century Viking revival. Perceived views of the Vikings as alternatively violent, piratical heathens or as intrepid adventurers owe much to conflicting varieties of the modern Viking myth that had taken shape by the early 20th century. Current popular representations of the Vikings are typically based on cultural clichés and stereotypes, complicating modern appreciation of the Viking legacy. Etymology. One etymology derives Viking from the feminine vik, meaning creek, inlay, small bay. Various theories have been offered that the word Viking may be derived from the name of the historical Norwegian district of Viken, meaning a person from Viken. According to this theory, the word simply described persons from this area, and it is only in the last few centuries that it has taken on the broader sense of early medieval Scandinavians in general. However, there are a few major problems with this theory. People from the Viken area were not called Viking in Old Norse manuscripts, but are referred to as Vikvara, Vik dwellers. In addition, that explanation could only explain the masculine and ignore the feminine, which is a serious problem because the masculine is easily derived from the feminine but hardly vice versa. The form also occurs as a personal name on some Swedish runestones. There is little indication of any negative connotation in the term before the end of the Viking Age. Another etymology derives Viking from the same root as on Vika, see mile, originally, the distance between two shifts of rowers, from the root *vik or *wick, as in the Proto-Germanic verb *wicken, to recede. This is found in the Proto-Nordic verb *wicken, to turn, similar to Old Icelandic vikja, to move, to turn, with well-attested nautical usages. Linguistically, this theory is better attested, and the term most likely predates the use of the sail by the Germanic peoples of northwestern Europe, because the Old Frisian speaking shows that the word was pronounced with a palatal K and thus in all probability existed in northwestern Germanic, before that palatalization happened. That is, in the 5th century or before. In that case, the idea behind it seems to be that the tired rower moves aside for the rested rower on the thwart when he relieves him. The Old Norse feminine Viking may originally have been a sea journey characterized by the shifting of rowers, i.e., a long-distance sea journey, because in the pre-sail era, the shifting of rowers would distinguish long-distance sea journeys. A Viking would then originally have been a participant on a sea journey characterized by the shifting of rowers. In that case, the word Viking was not originally connected to Scandinavian seafarers but assumed this meaning when the Scandinavians began to dominate the seas. In Old English, the word wissing appears first in the Anglo-Saxon poem, Widsith, which probably dates from the 9th century. In Old English, and in the history of the Archbishops of Hamburg, Bremen, written by Adam of Bremen in about 1070, the term generally referred to Scandinavian pirates or raiders. As in the Old Norse usages, the term is not employed as a name for any people or culture in general. The word does not occur in any preserved Middle English texts. The word Viking was introduced into modern English during the 18th century Viking revival, at which point it acquired romanticized heroic overtones of barbarian warrior or noble savage. During the 20th century, the meaning of the term was expanded to refer not only to seaborne raiders from Scandinavia and other places settled by them, but secondarily to any member of the culture that produced said raiders during the period from the late 8th to the mid-11th centuries, or more loosely from about 700 to as late as about 1100. As an adjective, the word is used to refer to ideas, phenomena, or artifacts connected with those people and their cultural life, producing expressions like Viking Age, Viking culture, Viking art, Viking religion, Viking ship, and so on. Other names: the Vikings were known as Askermani, Ashmen, by the Germans for the ash wood of their boats, Lochalinach by the Gaels, Ingdeen by the Anglo-Saxons. The Slavs, the Arabs, and the Byzantines knew them as the Russ or Rose, probably derived from various uses of Roths, related to rowing, or derived from the area of Roslagen in east-central Sweden, where most of the Vikings who visited the Slavic lands came from. Some archaeologists and historians of today believe that these Scandinavian settlements in the Slavic lands played a significant role in the formation of the Kievan Rus Federation, and hence the names and early states of Russia and Belarus. The modern-day name for Sweden in several neighboring countries is possibly derived from Roths, Ruotsa in Finnish and Ruotsi in Estonian. The Slavs and the Byzantines also called them Varangians. Scandinavian bodyguards of the Byzantine emperors were known as the Varangian Guard. History: Viking Age. The period from the earliest recorded raids in the 790s until the Norman conquest of England in 1066 is commonly known as the Viking Age. Of Scandinavian history, Vikings used the Norwegian Sea and Baltic Sea for sea routes to the south. The Normans were descended from Vikings who were given feudal overlordship of areas in northern France, the Duchy of Normandy, in the 10th century. In that respect, descendants of the Vikings continued to have an influence in northern Europe. Likewise, King Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, had Danish ancestors. 2 Vikings even ascended to the throne of England, with Sweyn Forkbeard claiming the English throne from 1013 to 1014 and his son Cnut the Great becoming King of England from 1016 to 1035. Geographically, a Viking Age may be assigned not only to Scandinavian lands, but also to territories under North Germanic dominance, mainly the Danelaw, including Scandinavian York, the administrative centre of the remains of the Kingdom of Northumbria, parts of Mercia, and East Anglia. Viking navigators opened the road to new lands to the north, west and east, resulting in the foundation of independent settlements in the Shetland, Orkney, and Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, and Lanzo Meadows, a short-lived settlement in Newfoundland, circa 1000. They may have been deliberately sought out, perhaps on the basis of the accounts of sailors who had seen land in the distance. The Greenland settlement eventually died out, possibly due to climate change. Viking dynasty also took control of territories in Slavic and Finno-Ugric-dominated areas of Eastern Europe, annexed Kiev in 882 to serve as the capital of the Kievan Rus. As early as 839, when Swedish emissaries are first known to have visited Byzantium, Scandinavians served as mercenaries in the service of the Byzantine Empire. In the late 10th century, a new unit of the imperial bodyguard formed, traditionally containing large numbers of Scandinavians. It was known as the Varangian Guard. The word Varangian may have originated in Old Norse, but in Slavic and Greek it could refer either to Scandinavians or Franks. The most eminent Scandinavian to serve in the Varangian Guard was Harald Hardrada, who subsequently established himself as King of Norway. Important trading ports during the period include Birka, Hedeby, Kaupang, Jorvik, Steril Ladoga, Novgorod, and Kiev. There is archaeological evidence that Vikings reached Baghdad, the center of the Islamic Empire. The Norse regularly plied the Volga with their trade goods: furs, tusks, seal fat for boat sealant, and slaves. Generally speaking, the Norwegians expanded to the north and west to places such as Ireland, Scotland, Iceland, and Greenland, the Danes to England and France, settling in the Danelaw and Normandy, and the Swedes to the east, founding the Kievan Rus, the original Russia. Among the Swedish runestones mentioning expeditions overseas, almost half tell of raids and travels to Western Europe. According to the Icelandic sagas, many Norwegian Vikings also went to Eastern Europe. In the Viking Age, the present-day nations of Norway, Sweden and Denmark did not exist, but were largely homogeneous and similar in culture and language, although somewhat distinct geographically. The names of Scandinavian kings are reliably known only for the later part of the Viking Age. After the end of the Viking Age, the separate kingdoms gradually acquired distinct identities as nations, which went hand in hand with their Christianization. Thus, the end of the Viking Age for the Scandinavians also marks the start of their relatively brief Middle Ages. Viking Expansion. The Vikings explored the northern islands and coasts of the North Atlantic, ventured south to North Africa and east to Russia, Constantinople, and the Middle East. They raided and pillaged, but also engaged in trade, settled wide-ranging colonies, and acted as mercenaries. Vikings under Leif Erikson, heir to Erik the Red, reached North America and set up short-lived settlements in present-day Land's End Meadows, Newfoundland, and Labrador, Canada. Viking expansion into continental Europe was limited. Their realm was bordered by powerful cultures to the south. Early on it was the Saxons, who occupied Old Saxony, located in what is now northern Germany. The Saxons were a fierce and powerful people, and were often in conflict with the Vikings. To counter the Saxon aggression and solidify their own presence, the Danes constructed the huge defense fortification of Danevirke in and around Hedeby. The Vikings soon witnessed the violent subduing of the Saxons by Charlemagne in the 30-year Saxon Wars in 772 to 804. The Saxon defeat resulted in their forced christening and absorption of Old Saxony in the Carolingian Empire. Fearing the Franks, this led the Vikings to further expand Danevirke, and the defense constructions were in use throughout the Viking Age and even up until 1864. The south coast of the Baltic Sea was ruled by the Obotrites, a federation of Slavic tribes loyal to the Carolingians and later the Frankish Empire. The Vikings, led by King Gudfred, destroyed the Obotrite city of Rerik on the southern Baltic coast in 808 AD and transferred the merchants and traders to Hedeby. This secured their supremacy in the Baltic Sea, which remained throughout the Viking Age. Motives. The motives driving the Viking expansion are a topic of much debate in Nordic history. One common theory posits that Charlemagne used force and terror to Christianize all pagans, leading to baptism, conversion or execution, and as a result, Vikings and other pagans resisted and wanted revenge. Professor Rudolf Simek states that, "It is not a coincidence if the early Viking activity occurred during the reign of Charlemagne. The penetration of Christianity into Scandinavia led to serious conflict, dividing Norway for almost a century. Another explanation is that the Vikings exploited a moment of weakness in the surrounding regions. England suffered from internal divisions and was relatively easy prey given the proximity of many towns to the sea or to navigable rivers. Lack of organized naval opposition throughout Western Europe allowed Viking ships to travel freely, raiding or trading as opportunity permitted. The decline in the profitability of old trade routes could also have played a role. Trade between Western Europe and the rest of Eurasia suffered a severe blow when the Roman Empire fell in the 5th century. The expansion of Islam in the 7th century had also affected trade with Western Europe. Raids in Europe, including raids and settlements from Scandinavia, were not something new and also seen long before the Vikings came. The Jutes invaded the British Isles 3 centuries earlier, pouring out from Jutland during the Age of Migrations, before the Danes settled there. The Saxons and the Angles did the same, embarking from mainland Europe. End of the Viking Age. During the Viking Age, Scandinavian men and women traveled to many parts of Europe and beyond, in a cultural diaspora that left its traces from Newfoundland to Byzantium. This period of energetic activity also had a pronounced effect in the Scandinavian homelands, which were subject to a variety of new influences. In the 300 years from the late 8th century, when contemporary chroniclers first commented on the appearance of Viking raiders, to the end of the 11th century, Scandinavia underwent profound cultural changes. By the late 11th century, royal dynasties legitimized by the Catholic Church were asserting their power with increasing authority and ambition, and the three kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden had taken shape. Towns appeared that functioned as secular and ecclesiastical administrative centers and market sites, and monetary economies began to emerge based on English and German models. By this time the influx of Islamic silver from the East had been absent for more than a century, and the flow of English silver had come to an end in the mid-11th century. Christianity had taken root in Denmark and Norway with the establishment of dioceses during the 11th century, and the new religion was beginning to organize and assert itself more effectively in Sweden. Foreign churchmen and native elites were energetic in furthering the interests of Christianity, which was now no longer operating only on a missionary footing, and old ideologies and lifestyles were transforming. By 1103, the first archbishopric was founded in Scandinavia, at Lund, Scania, then part of Denmark. The assimilation of the nascent Scandinavian kingdoms into the cultural mainstream of European Christendom altered the aspirations of Scandinavian rulers and of Scandinavians able to travel overseas, and change their relations with their neighbors. One of the primary sources of profit for the Vikings had been slave-taking. The medieval church held that Christians should not own fellow Christians as slaves, so chattel slavery diminished as a practice throughout northern Europe. This took much of the economic incentive out of raiding, though sporadic slaving activity continued into the 11th century. Scandinavian predation in Christian lands around the Northern Irish Seas diminished markedly. The kings of Norway continued to assert power in parts of northern Britain and Ireland, and raids continued into the 12th century. But the military ambitions of Scandinavian rulers were now directed toward new paths. In 1107, Sigurd I of Norway sailed for the eastern Mediterranean with Norwegian crusaders to fight for the newly established Kingdom of Jerusalem, and Danes and Swedes participated energetically in the Baltic Crusades of the 12th and 13th centuries.